G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Poll Position, our fortnightly look at the Guardian Essential poll results, where we peel back a little bit behind the politics of the day and look at what the public is thinking about things. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal country here in Canberra and Ngambri country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And obviously sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it's a beautiful day here in Ngunnawal country. I hope it is where you are too. Just a few tips before we begin to make sure everything runs smoothly. You can put questions for our panelists in the Q&A box, and you should be able to upvote questions from other people as well. Actually, I'm not sure that I did the settings for that, which I'll do just shortly, but you should be able to upvote questions and make comments on other people's questions as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it goes up on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel as well if you miss it or have to duck out for whatever reason. So this is the show where we unpack all the big political issues and dive into the latest polling trends and find out what you, the public, are thinking about various political issues. And today we'll be looking at the awkwardly named Aukus security arrangement, the nuclear submarines announcement that has really rocked Australia and the world, and pardon my French, pissed off France, amongst other things. Quite a big announcement with a lot of ramifications that we'll dig into today. Obviously, we've got several states now announcing their pathway out of lockdown here on the eastern seaboard. We're going into a few things related to COVID as per usual. And Katharine Murphy is running a little late today. She'll be joining us as soon as she can. Thanks so much, everyone. I can see we've already got north of 800 people on the line with us. So we'll get stuck into the polling pretty shortly. But our regular panelists are Katharine Murphy, Political Editor of Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media, Alan Beam, who's the head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program, and John Remington from Essential as well. Thanks so much for joining us today. Pete, I might come to you first. We'll get stuck into the slides in just a second, but you've just got your op-ed up on The Guardian today talking about some of these poll results and the fact that the nuclear submarine deal, all these big announcements, putting us on an election footing for, talking about national security and those kinds of things that are normally good for the coalition, might not be the shot in the arm that they're looking for.
Well, I don't know if I'm a cynical soul, but my long-term observation in politics that if Conservative governments get into trouble, defence is the best form of attack, while our, what do we call him? The fella down under was strutting his stuff on the global stage last week. I was looking at it very much in terms of the local politics dynamic. I read this as the plan B breaker glass. That if they come to the conclusion that after the summer they can't win on hope, and we don't know what summer's going to hold, running on fear, and particularly fear of the Chinese threat, is a crude but potentially effective fallback option. So I saw this, and I know Alan will talk about the actual policy behind the nuclear subs deal in a moment, but in the raw politics, I really saw this as an attempt to hedge bets. The choice of running now on this ahead of other global forums like Glasgow, which we know is coming up, I think is pointed. The fact that the Prime Minister turned to the old white guys, the Boris Johnson, who's just dragged Britain out of the cooperative relationships of Europe, and Joe Biden, who has just managed to save America from Trump, but is still very vulnerable to Trump. So they're the guys that we're turning to at the moment. We've got Europe who are feeling aggrieved. We've got China who are feeling, well, China's got many feels at the moment, but one of them is that Australia is hostile. I think there's 13 grievances they've put out. And then you've got the rest of the region wondering what the hell Australia's doing. So it has not been you know, a cost-free exercise. But if it was to be successful in shifting the debate, you could see why that is something that this PM in particular would at least have a crack at. In my piece, I sort of see the echoes back to 2001 and the Tampa election, and I can sort of see parallels that could unfold here with Labor kind of trying to not engage. But if you remember back to 2001, and many in this room would have lived the pain that the government slowly positioned Labor into a position where it split itself down the middle, particularly when they excised Christmas Island from Australian waters. All of which is to say that there is so many moving parts here that are far more than a sub. And so it was interesting to check whether in the initial announcement we thought any of this was landing. And I think the conclusion, we'll get to the numbers, and Katharine's in the room now. Hi, Katharine. Some of it does, but it's not a slam dunk. That's probably all I can say at the moment.
Yeah, welcome, Katharine. We were just talking kind of about, you know, the last couple of weeks in politics, and particularly the Aukus security arrangement. We'll go to Alan in just a second, but normally we do come to you for a bit of a what's been happening in politics overview.
Yes.
We're kind of talking about, you know, the fact that this really was quite a big announcement, and the fallout from it hasn't really stopped yet. We've certainly annoyed France to no end. And yeah, I guess, could we just get your view on that announcement in particular and the fallout from it that we've seen?
Sure. And sorry, everyone, I'm late, and forgive me, I've momentarily lost my headphones. So if I get mad barking dogs next door or people screaming on the nature strip, just apologies in advance. Okay, Aukus, yes, a very big deal. It's sort of one of those funny things, because it's both something and nothing, in to the extent that this is an agreement to have an agreement. It's something that Australia will consider over the next 18 months. But in terms of our relationship in the region, in terms of the Cold War in the region, in terms of that old sort of binary question about whether or not Australia would choose between our most important economic partner and our most important security partner, which has sort of been a rolling debate for the last decade. Where would we choose? How would we choose? When would we choose? Well, it was sort of silly, because, you know, when push comes to shove, this would always be the decision, but it was a real decision point in that how and where do we align ourselves with our allies at a dangerous time in the region. And it basically, obviously the Americans are sharing this technology with us, or that's the path we're going down. That will sort of tie Australia into the US military complex. I mean, that is already the case, because obviously we don't defend ourselves in Australia. We are already tied into security arrangements with others, but this was sort of one of those genuine moments in time, sort of genuine points in history where Australia made a decisive step in a particular geostrategic direction. So, and yes, obviously, the French government are very aggrieved by it. And you would be. You would be. A whole secret dialogue happened for many, many months that was not disclosed to the French. And even, it's not even clear, well, it is clear, sorry, I should say it is clear. The Prime Minister rang Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of Japan, the Prime Minister of India, like a whole bunch of people before he told Emmanuel Macron at 9 p.m. on the night or whatever, oh, by the way, the submarine deal's off. So yeah, it's pretty extraordinary lead up, pretty extraordinary story, pretty extraordinary consequences would be my summary.
Yeah, and I want to welcome everyone. We've cracked 1,000 people, so we've got 1,022 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. Alan, I want to come to you next. We often talk at the Australia Institute about what we mean by security. Katharine there's just kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, we've very much annoyed an ally in France and made this kind of big and consequential decision. Does it actually make Australia more secure?
Ebony, I'd like to flex off the remarks of Peter first, that I don't think this has got very much to do with national security. I think this has got a lot to do with the government's security at the next election. Any benefits to national security, and I'm doubtful that there are very many, they won't accrue for a good 2-3 decades. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is quite a cynical but quite a clever preparation of the grounds on which the next election might actually be fought. If the government doesn't pick up its game on so many other issues, it's got a brilliant fallback position at the moment, which I suspect will play reasonably well, to judge by the essential poll figures out today, that there is a fair measure of support for this. And given that on today's figures, the Conservative government is much more trusted on both economic and security grounds, I think that this is the beginning of a swing that the government would try to put in place for the next election. So that's the first comment I'd make. The second one I'd make is about national security. And I think that some of the consequences of this huge announcement, and I agree with Katharine very much, this is pretty momentous actually. Some of the consequences of it I don't think have been thought through at all. And there are just two that I'll pick on for the moment. The first is this: imperceptibly, but quite clearly, over the last 7 or 8 years, we've had a creep away from the defence of Australia as being the fundamental underpinnings of our national security policy to a much more projective doctrine, which would take warfare to the front door of whoever the aggressor might be. Now, that's a very, very big change in policy. Very expensive change too, by the way, because the moment you put your forces, say, 4,000 kilometres away, the supply and logistics infrastructure for that is just enormous. So it's a fairly big thing to comprehend and contemplate, I think, and I don't think it's been thought through. The second is an aspect which we picked up in a paper that we put on our website last week, and it's that these submarines, if we ever get them, are optimised for hunting and killing the big submarines of an adversary, the nuclear ballistic missile submarines. And so inevitably, Australia is being played into the conduct of nuclear war. That is also, in my opinion, a really big step, and one which I think we would all need to think about very, very deeply before we ever were to sign up to the fact that we now are a patch on the side of American forces in the Pacific designed to sink nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Pretty big step.
Yeah. Well, having given that great introduction, thanks everyone. We might now go to some of the actual results from the essential poll today. So I think we've got it here. Here we go. So Pete, this goes to what you were talking about originally, that national security is kind of home turf, strong turf for the coalition.
Indeed, it's really interesting when you line up the major parties and which areas people trust them to handle. This is an old chestnut. We know the coalition always owns management of the economy, but even more so national security and even maintaining international relations. So they are sweet spots for the coalition. Although I would add, if you look at the unshores, that's significant. On national security, that's 32%. So the coalition's only at 41, even while we say they own it. If you go down the path and look at the other issues like Australian jobs, climate change, fair wages and conditions, obviously they're Labor's sweet spot. So part of constructing a pathway to victory is always to play on your home turf. The other one that throws me there is how close health is. That's normally a Labor brand advantage, as is education. They're kind of line ball at the moment. But if you just looked at that and said, what hill do we want to die on? national security is up there with the economy for the coalition, which is why, you know, I don't think you need to be conspiracy theorist to see an ulterior motive in what's playing out at the moment.
And to take us specifically to the implications of Aukus, just walk us through some of these results here.
Like, I think it shows a bit of a nuanced view of this, actually. 62% believe Australia's right to build strong relations with US and the UK for its national defence. So it's not like they're pushing back, but they're also seeing the strains on China, and also the impact on our relationships with Europe, which is the other piece in this, I think. And when we get a chance to go back to Alan, I'd be interested in his view on this. It always struck me that by teaming up with the French, it was almost a way of Australia hedging its bet if it had to make a choice between China and the US in terms of the mythical confrontation down the path, and the fact we've walked away from that kind of French EU playbook is really significant. But ultimately, like, it's not that people aren't accepting that AUKUS is fine. It's just that I also think it's not like they're saying it's Christmas either.
Yeah. And we've got here more about the actual nuclear submarine.
So here, and this is a figure. So I was really keen to find out whether people thought it made us more secure, less secure, or no different, given that it is on the Never Never. Only 19% less secure. If you're an advocate of the strategy, you'd say, well, 45% feel more secure. I think that 36 not affect Australia's security is relevant as well. So I actually read this as adding up the 36 and 19 to get to 55 who don't see this as a game changer, which again undermines the thesis that this is an absolute slam dunk where it comes to recasting national security. And at the risk of dominating, if you just go to the last one, which is about the broader question of China, I think this is really interesting as well. So what is the problem we're trying to solve here? If it is just a defence deal, then on its merits, AUKUS is okay. But I think this is interesting, and it backs in. I was surprised at how big the middle ground is on this. So while there is a lot of fury and noise diplomatically about China and Australia being at loggerheads and the trade issues and the human rights issue, the majority of Australians see this as a complex relationship to be managed rather than a threat to be confronted. Although I also note very small now, only 10% see it's a positive opportunity to be realised, which was really the consensus through the 90s and the early part of this century.
Yeah, so I wonder if, Katharine, I can come to you first on that. Were there anything in those results that kind of were different to what you might expect given, recent discourse on all these issues?
I think, look, I wasn't surprised by the nuance in it because these are complicated issues. They're very well ventilated in this country. A lot of the debate is cartoonish, but these issues are very well ventilated in the public square. People understand because they have been direct beneficiaries of Australia's relationship with China in an economic sense, that there are a bunch of issues to manage here, or a bunch of concerns to manage here, from economic security through to physical security. So I can't say I was massively surprised that there was a lot of nuance in the response to it. Obviously, people don't think it's a terrible idea. People, quite the contrary. But they understand the thing that the data told me was that people understand it's a consequential decision. People get that. And people also understand the consequences of it, or at least a couple of the immediate direct ones, which is our diplomatic relationship with China, such as it, it doesn't really exist anymore, but such as it is. And also, our position with other partners, who are more independently minded in a security sense, like the Europeans. And people are obviously aware that there are trade discussions and other things afoot as well. So, I guess it was sort of more or less where I thought it'd be. Yeah.
Alan, I'll come to you next. We did a podcast on this not that long ago, but I wonder specifically on that idea that this is, related to particularly the nuclear submarine still related to China. You kind of push back on that a little bit, but that's not to say it doesn't have implications in the region. Could you just walk us through what some of the issues are that you think this deal throws up in the short term for the Australian government?
Yeah, I think that the poll results today, I think are rather consoling for me, because it suggests that in the broader community, there are fewer people who are tied into that confected binary of choice between China and the United States. I think there's much more movement in there that's possible over time. And that, I think, is a very good thing. What this submarine deal does, that is the AUKUS deal, along with, in some respects, the Quad, which was has got to be seen as part of the same thing, I think, is to lock us into an old way of thinking about global and national security. We are reattaching ourselves to the motherland, Britain, a concept that we haven't had during my lifetime. But here we are, we're back to it again. And we have strengthened once more our relationship with the United States. But interestingly, the United States and Britain and Australia all getting entirely different things out of this. The Brits are scrambling for relevance. And if they think they're going to find it again in the Far East, that's going to be, I think, difficult. They certainly won't find it with aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. And it's also interesting, just noting today's news, that Keir Starmer, who came out in support of this AUKUS thing in Britain, has got a fairly big punch in the nose from the Labor conference in Brighton that have directed a fair bit of criticism to that support. So you can see it's not a done deal at all in Britain in seeking to make Britain great again. The United States is obviously trying to recover ground in Asia, and it's recovering it, I think, in the way in which it's most familiar, which is to beef up its military image in Asia, rather than looking at the other aspects where it is lagging behind, which is obviously in the geopolitical domain, which is a force essentially of Chinese culture. And as for Australia, well, we remained frightened as usual. I mean, on a good day, we're pusillanimous, but on a bad day, we're fearful. And I think we're heading back to the old fearfulness game again by thinking that the possession of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, which means that at any one time you've probably only got 3, is going to make a material difference to our long-term security, is sort of like believing in castles in Spain. It's much more symbolic than it is real, but it does play into trying to alleviate the fear which our politicians are really so clever in generating in the first place.
Well, that might take us back to the poll results now. So I know this debate, Pete, has thrown us back into a discussion about whether or not, if we're going to have nuclear subs, why don't we have nuclear power in Australia, that old chestnut. Can you take us through these results?
Yeah, and this is the other potential wedge as well for Labor, which I think they've skillfully avoided diving too far into. I'll just say that I think Labor's strategy of asking questions at the moment, because this deal is totally adequate. Support for nuclear energy is at 50%. That's as high as I've seen it. I got politicised in the mid-'80s in the nuclear disarmament and peace movement, so I find it pretty hard to be reading out these numbers, I must say. But from 25% 2011, the Fukushima disaster, of those who remember, a decade later, those numbers have doubled of people that are prepared to countenance nuclear energy as a source. About local power. But it gets even funkier, I think, on the next couple of slides there. Support for use of technology. We had to throw in the support for Australia to develop its own nuclear weapon capabilities. And there you go. 30% would have a crack at that.
Yeah.
So that whole, I think that there's been a generation since we really looked at nuclear energy and the risks and the limited rewards, I think climate change has probably recast it a little bit as well. And there's a very well organised lobby who see this as the next version of an extractive industry to power the future. John also put together some interesting slides, I think, on the next one, around preferred sources for energy of government support, and renewables is really high, but if there is 19% that would like to see the government develop new nuclear power stations. And we'd asked this question previously without the nuclear option being, they're just putting up renewables, coal and gas. And John will help me here, but I think it really shows that the people that are just looking for a fossil fuel will grab onto nuclear if they're given that opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So in the past, when we've asked this question without the nuclear option, renewables were just hovering just above 70%. So you can see there's about 6%, less than 10% have shifted towards nuclear there. But the big difference are with those fossil fuels. So without nuclear, support for gas and coal were about 12 to 14% respectively. So you can see there support for those fossil fuels is almost halved as people have moved to back nuclear in that case. So if you've got an idea of who might be or what type of people are more supportive of coal and gas, they're the people who are more likely to be pushing nuclear.
The other thing that's worth throwing in there just on the nukes, coalition voters support nuclear energy 65-20, but Labor it's 42-39. And Greens, it's 50 opposed, but 38 support. And you'd have to say that's a climate thing, not, I don't know, maybe it's other things, but there you go.
Katharine, those results are interesting, but the reality is that a nuclear domestic power industry here faces quite a lot of hurdles, not the least, I'm assuming, would be cost, amongst other things. Is that where we're headed, do you think? Are we going to go into another debate about having a nuclear energy domestic system here?
Well, the thing about this debate is it chases its tail. We started having this debate. Well, look, we've been having this debate for a very long time, but the sort of modern sort of reset on the nuclear debate started in the Howard years when Ziggy Switkowski did a review of nuclear technology, and that review actually was the precursor to the Howard government accepting emissions trading, because what that review made plain is that for nuclear to be economic in Australia, it would require a carbon price. So the Switkowski review led to at the end stage Howard government accepting the need for emissions trading. And then obviously we can then summarise the next 10 years as just a multifaceted debacle. Regulars on this catch up know how I feel about these issues, but anyway, so every time we get a reset on the nuclear debate, the question needs to be asked, well, does everybody accept a carbon price? Do the advocates of nuclear power accept a carbon price? Because it will be necessary in order to make nuclear economic with other low emissions sources of power generation. So again, we sort of locked in this argument that chases its tail. I personally think, though, obviously, Pete's mentioned, climate change has changed the dynamics of the nuclear debate. That's basically what I've charted there. That's like a 20-year change. And that's, back when this debate started in the Howard era, I was quite relaxed about nuclear power because I think we need to bring down emissions by whatever technology is available. That's my view. Things have moved along, though, a considerable distance since that point in terms of the economics of renewables and firming technologies like batteries and other things. So, it's sort of, again, a bit strange to have a nuclear debate when the technology has moved along to such an extent. But with that said, I mean, one of the issues I've got with this nuclear subs deal is that it is really quite strange for the Commonwealth to say we're going to basically construct nuclear submarines. We're going to import in a sealed container the reactors that power the subs. We're going to put them into the subs and off they go. And we can do nuclear subs now because the reactors that power the subs last for the operating life of the vessel. So we don't actually have to get in there and pull rods out and put rods in and all of that sort of stuff that you had to do with prior versions of this technology. But it's sort of passing strange that if we're okay with nuclear power submarines, that we don't have a domestic industry in order to service them. It's sort of like, logically, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But, logically, a lot of things in politics don't make sense to me. And yet here we all are.
Yeah, that's right. Alan, I might come to you next. Obviously, the fact that we didn't have a domestic nuclear energy system here was for many years, a reason why nuclear submarines were just off the table. Can you just take us a little bit into, I guess, the technical specifications around nuclear submarines and some of those issues about whether or not we have the capability to service them, for example?
Right. Katharine's put a finger on what is one of the many puzzling elements of this. I mean, we live in a world of absurdity. We've just got to accept that. You don't have to refuel the modern pressure water reactors. As Katharine said, they're put in there and they stay for the life of the submarine. But submarines are not only a reactor, they're not only an engine, they're all of the other systems that hang off that engine. And there's an enormous deficit in Australian industry to be able to support all of those systems that actually make the entire submarine. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that it goes back to a remark that Peter made earlier, I think, when he was just commenting in passing about whether Australia's approach earlier was to hedge a bit by linking in with the Naval Group in France as a way of signalling a measure of autonomy in the way in which we might acquire and use a submarine capability. The previous one, we'd got what was essentially a Swedish submarine and adapted it and built the Collins. So the second one was going to be the short fin Barracuda, but we wouldn't face up, and this is only 3 years ago, we wouldn't face up to whether it would be cheaper and better to get the French nuclear boat. We thought that it would be cheaper and better to thoroughly redesign it, thereby, as I understand it, almost trying to defy the laws of physics, because the vessel would become so heavy that it would need all of its energy just to propel itself along. And you need to understand that the difference between conventional and nuclear underwater is very substantial. Underwater, a conventional submarine goes along at about a quick walking pace. A nuclear submarine goes along at around 50 kilometres an hour. So that there is a substantial difference in range, speed, endurance, all of those sorts of things, which would have made a nuclear submarine on paper an attractive option for Australia, but the Americans would not have it. And that was the stumbling point, essentially. The Americans have changed their position. And this is where it's quite a novelty. We have to think our way around why have the Americans changed their position? And I suspect that has to do with, as I said, plastering Australia onto the side of the Pacific Fleet to give it a bit more capability, a few more options in the conduct of nuclear warfare. And that's already being spoken about quite openly in Washington right at the moment. I think the second reason that the Americans have done that is because they want to make sure that the military balance in the Pacific remains very, very firmly on their side over the rest of this century. And we have now effectively signed up to that. So as I said earlier, they're two of the very difficult problems that we're going to have to think our way through. My final remark is this: we have given no thought yet to what the responsibilities Australia has under the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards arrangements for these submarines and their power plants. I'm guessing at the moment but I think we're going to find it hard to comply with the requirements of the safeguards arrangements to which we are signatory, because to do so, you have to be able to say what the exact materials are that you've got under your control, how much of them you have, what the concentration of them is, that is how enriched they are, all of those sorts of things. And I would be gobsmacked if either the Brits or the Americans were prepared to put out on a public piece of paper the ingredients for their power plant. And I suspect that if there's a showstopper, and I think there are many of them, if there is one that would really stop it all, it would be the unwillingness of the Americans to share any of the material information about their submarine reactors and Australia's inability to comply. And we'd have a choice, we could be non-compliant, but that would look very bad, I think.
Yeah, we might go to a few questions now from the audience and then come back maybe at the end to some of those last COVID slides. So the first question I've got here is from Ilsa Fate, who says a lot of, quote, moderate liberals, unquote, have been making the right noises lately regarding doing more on climate change. Do you think this is just a response to the threat posed by independents, especially in North Sydney, or do you think they really are changing internally? And also, what would be the impact on the government's credibility if the Prime Minister doesn't go to COP? Katharine, I might throw to you on that one.
Sure. Okay. Well, on the second bit of that question, which is the impact on Australia's credibility if the Prime Minister doesn't go to the COP, look, honestly, I don't think that makes any difference. What matters is what we pledge at the COP. That's the substance of how Australia is viewed. Obviously, it would be preferable if the Prime Minister turned up, but the critical thing that we're going to work through over the next few weeks in terms of internally within the government is what commitments we will give. And obviously, once we know what those commitments are, we will judge the merits of them. In terms of the concern of metropolitan libs about climate change, I think the honest answer to that question is that certainly political pressure in these heartland seats is galvanising for this group of people. We saw that in the last election cycle, where the Liberal Party faced pressure in some of its safest seats, while Labor's primary vote tanked in regional Queensland. So we've sort of got this lopsided dynamic in climate politics in Australia. But the interesting thing about this is that it might all start to wash through over time, but park that thought for a minute. So look, yes, political pressure explains part of it, but I do think among this group of people, they understand actually what needs to happen. They understand that if Australia fails to develop coherent and credible targets, that Australia will pay a price, both in terms of our position, our alliances, our trade in the world, capital flows. Australia is highly vulnerable, obviously, to adverse capital flows. I think some people in the Liberal Party, despite the way they carry on, have understood this for quite some period of time. But I think the literacy and fluency about the costs of inaction are starting to settle around the government. And so you see both of those dynamics, political pressure and also more fluency with the risks associated with Australia remaining a pariah on climate action.
Yeah, I guess, Pete, coming to you on that one, just for the politics of it, I guess. Katharine's pointed out, there's a lot of libs kind of talking about the consequences of inaction and the potential flow of capital, but is any of that enough to convince the Matt Canavans of the world?
Yeah, probably not. But I think the dynamic of those community independents is more profound than that. There's a bit of a nudge on climate issues, but there will also, if there are independent campaigns run in those blue ribbon Liberal seats, it does two things. It draws resources away from their contest with Labor, and it also draws attention away from potentially senior ministers. And I think if we want to have an optimistic view of how the run-up to the election goes, I think the Libs have got two areas where they risk being wedged on their own right flank. The first one is around climate, and the second one is around compulsion when it comes to vaccination to participate as society opens up. We probably won't get to it today, but there was a really interesting number that I'm going to delve into deeper that shows that, for instance, with people who say they will never get vaccinated, it's now small at 7%, but 23% of all those saying they're going to vote for right-wing independents say they'll never get vaccinated. And they are a constituency that the LNP has to keep talking to. And there's this porous edge between your Canavans and your Christensens and your Kellys at that right, which reminds me of some of the difficulties Labor's faced on their left flank when they're fighting on issues of principle with the Greens and charting a way forward there. So I think the whole independence issue is going to be fascinating, and it may not be the seats that have won, it's the way that then the contest is altered by their intervention that could be quite significant.
Yeah, Alan, I wonder if I might just come to you, building on all that's all a very domestic view. When it comes to climate policy and the upcoming COP and I guess Australia's credibility on the international stage, what do you foresee in the months ahead there as we get to COP?
Well, I feel as though I'm at midnight on a very sort of foggy, cloudy night, actually. I can't see much at all. We've rewritten the playbook about how you really do conduct appallingly bad, bumble-footed diplomacy. We have become probably the world's experts in that, and not sort of simply starting with the wonderful insiders' intervention on COVID last year, which was just pretty amazing, but the whole of the way in which the Aukus thing was dealt with was, to me, simply extraordinary. I know there are plenty of people who say that decisions of such moment have to be kept secret and nobody's to be told because all sorts of things will happen before you release them, but there was no preparation for this whatsoever. And, you know, if you want to give China a poke in the eye, do you really do it by giving the French a poke in the eye, then giving the Indonesians and the Malaysians a poke in the eye, give the Kiwis one as well, and then make sure that you're publicly humiliated when the President of the United States can't remember your name? That all looks sort of pretty khaki-handed to me, pretty cack-handed. And so as I look at the way in which the manoeuvring around the Glasgow COP is going, I'm seeing the same signs of really poor diplomatic practice, no sense of what you do. If the Prime Minister wimps it, well, he wimps it. You know, he doesn't hold the hose, but he doesn't mind getting one in Glasgow by the look of it. So, you know, that's his problem. And I think Katharine's quite right. It makes no difference. What makes the difference, of course, is what we say we're going to do. And until that becomes clear, I think it's very hard to project what the next couple of months looks like on the international stage. But I will say that we've got a fair bit of work to do in Southeast Asia. We've got to mend the fences with Indonesia. It is a bad thing if the Prime Minister can't visit Indonesia regularly because we are so prone to stumbling. And I also think that there's something that we have to do around the Quad as well, because that's gone off in a rather strange direction where it's become a kind of advertising billboard for a whole lot of American companies. Boeing, Blackstone, Accenture, whoever else wants to cough up a bit of money into this, suddenly use a communique as a way of advertising. I just found that quite extraordinary too. So that also has to do with the credibility of the enterprise, in my opinion.
Alan, I'll come to you quickly on this next question too from Ronald Smith, because it was an interesting one for me. Will a 2024 President Trump uphold the new defence pact and submarines deal, or do what he did with NATO and tell us to pay more or walk away? We've done all this obviously in the context of a Biden administration, but there is a chance that we could be seeing another Trump government in at the next election.
Yes, well, certainly the polls in the United States are indicating that pretty strongly at the moment. I don't think any of those options are actually mutually exclusive. I think that somebody like Donald Trump is capable of doing all those things and a few more things besides. Certainly, Emmanuel Macron, I think, has some reason for saying that during the Trump administration, NATO was effectively brain dead. And the idea that NATO should pay for itself, when the original idea of NATO was that the United States paid for it because it actually gave the United States global reach, is to turn the whole thing on its head. So I would expect that we will be given the same sort of message from Trump. But who can tell? We've got 18 months of study and analysis of this thing to go. And then there's the US election, which I think could be a watershed election. Robert Kagan had some really interesting remarks to make in the Washington Post just this week. So I'm sort of feeling more on the fearful side than on the pusillanimous side, Eb.
Yeah. Katharine, just coming to you on that, it strikes me that this nuclear, I mean, we're calling it a deal, but there's no signed contract. Not that those are worth much nowadays either. But there are a lot of risks there still. A potential Trump administration, you know, whatever the cost ends up being for these nuclear submarines. Like, there's still a lot that we don't know here.
I do think the question we should have asked in this poll was what Australians' view of the nuclear submarine deal would be if Donald Trump was in the White House rather than Joe Biden. I suspect the view would be different. Also, in terms of the timeframes for the negotiation of this partnership, it's sort of like an 18-month-ish process to determine whether or not we proceed or not. I suppose if you're a cynical person, you could say that gives Australia an out in the lead up to the next presidential election, although that would be an interesting reverse ferret to watch. I'm not quite sure how we'd pull that off. But anyway, I just thought the timings were interesting. And yeah, and look, Biden, look, I don't know, maybe he can stabilise his position at this point in time. It looks pretty bad. Polling looks bad. They obviously haven't been able to get their main stimulus infrastructure bill through the legislature in the States. You know, you would hope for the sanity of Americans and the sanity of the world that things improve, but you wouldn't bet the house on it either.
No, that's exactly right. The next question is from Alan Collegado, who says, will the government's handling of the pandemic cease to be a factor by the time we get to vote at the next federal election? Katharine, I might come back to you on that one. Obviously, we don't know when the next federal election will be, but that might take us back to the last few slides here. But just if I can get your initial response to that, how much do we think COVID will still be a major issue?
Yeah, well, it does, Eb, as you say, it does depend a little on when the election is. My sort of working supposition has been the Prime Minister will return, he'll return in January, but Australia will kind of wake up on the 26th of January and will be an election on the 27th. But that may not be right, and views around the government vary about that. I suppose I thought in my mind it would be an election about what comes after COVID, but increasingly I think we're not there. We're not in the what comes after COVID period at all, because we're still in the outbreak now. Once we move down this reopening path, and obviously the lockdown states have all given now milestones about when various things will open, and that's a very slow process over the remaining months of this year, we'll sort of be in a different psychological place. But what happens once everything opens, though, is in all likelihood a very big increase in cases. I think I'm not sure how much the community is prepared for that. Obviously, vaccination and double vaccination will hopefully save a lot of lives and keep a lot of people out of hospital. But once we move into COVID normal, that means living with COVID, which means a lot more cases. So it sort of depends, I think, on how that transition goes. Whether Australians feel like they're still very much in the middle of a pandemic, or whether they're starting to move past it. And we sort of haven't really had a massive amount of debate in Australia about, in America, I think the debate sort of shorthand is Build Back Better, and other places around the world. We sort of haven't really seemed to have the bandwidth in Australia yet to sort of get ourselves to that conversation. Now, you'd think a fair bit of conversation around that would happen during the election cycle, but I think that's a bit hard to predict. So, sorry, I mean, that's a bit long-winded, that answer, but what I'm trying to say is that my own view about that's changing. I sort of thought the election would be about COVID, what next, but increasingly I think it may not be. It may be still sort of in the dynamics of the pandemic.
In the thick of it, so to speak. So Pete, just coming to these last couple of slides here.
Yeah, and I think sorry, you go. Oh, look, I just think it reinforces what Katharine was just saying. We don't know what the summer looks like yet. And there is one scenario where the most moderate, predictions of the modelers comes to bear, and it's like a bad flu season over summer. There's another where hospitals can't cope with the number of people getting really ill. Morrison, this is a combination of very good and quite good, so it's a bit hard to make sense, but as you guys that have been following this for a while, up in the high 70s through 2020, sort of reached an nadir a few weeks ago in the around 35%, back up to 46, I think, this week, but only 11% saying he's done a very good job. I think there's a sense that particularly the second lockdown, and I don't know if it's because Labor prosecuted a pretty good argument on vaccines and quarantines, and just because it was also true, like he bore a degree of responsibility for the second wave, whether or not it would have happened like it has through the rest of the world. And it's created this sort of fragmentation of the way that the nation views him. If you go to the next slide, you'll also see something else interesting that's going on. In South Australia's had a bit of a dip, but that's a small number. New South Wales is a bit of a recovery, and I'm also not sure if that is a calm before the storm, because it's also happening for the state government. So as the promise of reopening comes, people are feeling better, and then the unknown is, and then what? In Victoria, it's almost the opposite. Over the last couple of weeks, not just the feds, but if you go to the next slide, also the state governments, not 6% drop, but down to 44. So whereas New South Wales has kind of sort of reached its nadir and heading up, that outpouring that was manifested on the streets with the violent protests by a fringe is also speaking to something more broadly going on that I think Victorians have just had enough. Meanwhile, over in WA, things are still tickety-boo, and we had the AFL Grand Final, full house, 60,000 people. Good game, by the way. In WA, you're running a campaign that's basically who's going to support the state government. And I don't think Morrison can win seats in WA. I suspect that's the same in Queensland. It's whether Labor can pick him up. I'm not sure what happens in New South Wales and Victoria, particularly if these are the states where you're not starting from zero COVID, where if the opening up leads to deaths, who cops the blame, and how can any candidate who's been in power build a credible story about moving forward based on what's already happened?
Yeah,
again,
that's
the
a
roadmaps
good,
are different.
I was just going to say, with the roadmaps, that's kind of been the big news from the last week. We've had all those states in lockdown, including the ACT, but obviously the big ones are New South Wales and Victoria. Walk us through these results, Pete.
Well, it's really different. We gave people the three options we've given on the feds before as well. Well, actually four: understand the plan, have confidence, much more confidence in New South Wales, 48 to 36, understand the plan but don't have confidence, That's where the VIX have got a bit of a problem at the moment. 50 and then 40 for New South Wales, and pretty low for those that don't know what's going on, which shows that most people are pretty engaged in where we are, given it's the most disruptive bit of public policy in our lifetime.
Yeah, and just to finish up on vaccines.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting slide because with all the images of the carnage on the streets of Melbourne, it's a very small number who are in the anti-vax camp, 6 to 7%. There are some that have not got booked yet, but this is what I was saying earlier. If you unpack that 7%, Labor voters about 3%, Coalition voters about 4%, Green voters I think 6%, 23% of those that say they will vote for One Nation, UAP or a right-wing independent will never get vaccinated. I think that's an interesting dynamic because they've got an outsized influence on the right flank of the LNP.
There's a few people there wondering what happened to Tasmania. Am I correct, Pete, that there's just two small numbers there? It's not that we've forgotten about them.
Yeah, we're a bit cheap and cheerful and we just don't get the numbers in Tassie to sort of give a meaningful state breakdown. South Australia only just gets in and ACT doesn't touch the sides. Sorry, guys. We just need a bigger sample, but that, that's all a cost and everything like that.
Yeah, from a small population size. And Pete, just to finish up with you as well, I know as head of the Australia Institute Centre for Responsible Tech, you've got a new podcast coming out soon. Do you want to tell people about that before we go?
Yeah, that's really exciting. So the other hat I wear is working with the Australia Institute around issues of responsible technology, such as Instagram, running a platform for kids, which has been in the news today. But every fortnight we run an event a bit like this, which used to be called Tech Talk until we tried to turn into a podcast and realized there were thousands of tech talks out there. So we've become burning platforms. It's myself, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch, and Dan Stinton, who's the Managing Director of Guardian Australia. And we just have a look at the world in tech every fortnight in one of these. And then we've also started uploading it as a podcast. So I'm sure you'll be able to find it through the Australia Institute websites. And if you ever want to drop into yet another Zoom, we'd be really pleased to have you along.
Yeah, so that'll be Friday week is the next Burning Platforms webinar, and you'll get an email from us if you're on our list once Burning Platforms goes up as a podcast, so you can subscribe to that and it'll go up on the Australia Institute website as well. I just want to thank everyone so much. It was a huge turnout today, some really great questions in there, and thanks so much for coming along today. Thanks Katharine, John, Alan and Pete as always. There's never a dull moment in politics, but it's nice to discuss it every week, which with such level heads and people with interesting takes. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks everyone for your questions and for joining us today. We'll do it again in 2 weeks' time. And tomorrow we've got a webinar on with the renowned actor Eric Thompson from Pact to the Rafters and the Lumineers, as well as the CEO of Screen Producers Australia, Matthew Diener. That'll be about how we can protect Australian content in the age of Netflix. So please join us for that. You can sign on to that on the australiainstitute.org.au. And thanks again for joining us today. Get vaccinated as soon as you can. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in a fortnight, if not tomorrow. Bye, everyone.